Harry Potter wasn't the hero of his own story, and the 7 books that bear his name are actually a detailed chronicle of how a passive and curious boy was moved through a narrative by more competent people who understood that the prophecy didn't require Harry to be smart or brave or even particularly skilled. It just required him to show up and die at the right moment, which is exactly what he did before the story granted him an unearned resurrection and a return to a wizarding world that learned absolutely nothing from a war that was entirely preventable. The fundamental problem with Harry Potter as a protagonist isn't that he makes mistakes or that he struggles or that he needs help from his friends, because those are normal characteristics of any hero's journey, and they create opportunity for growth and relationships and the kind of character development that makes a story emotionally resonant. The problem is that Harry never develops agency, never moves from being reactive to proactive, never transforms from someone who has things happen to him into someone who makes things happen, and the narrative not only fails to recognize this as a flaw, but actively frames his passivity as a virtue, his lack of curiosity as humility, his willingness to be manipulated as loyalty, and his complete failure to question the systems that created Voldemort as evidence of his pure and noble character. Watch how Harry moves through the series and pay attention to who actually solves the problems, who figures out what's happening, who develops the plans, and who provides the critical information or magical ability that allows each book's central conflict to be resolved. In Philosopher's Stone, Hermione is the one who figures out that Fluffy is guarding something, that Nicholas Flamel is connected to the stone, that Snape is trying to steal it. Harry's contribution is noticing his scar hurts and being willing to go through the trapdoor, where he survives the challenges primarily through luck, and because Hermione solved the potions puzzle, and because his mother's protection prevents Quirrell from touching him. In Chamber of Secrets, Hermione figures out the basilisk. Harry only survives the encounter because Fawkes arrives with a sorting hat containing Gryffindor's sword, and because his mother's love protection apparently extends to preventing basilisk venom from killing him until Fawkes cries on the wound. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione has a time turner that enables him to save Sirius and Buckbeak. Harry's contribution is casting Patronus he already knew he could cast because he'd seen himself do it, which is a time travel paradox that makes no sense, but that's a separate problem. Goblet of Fire follows the same pattern amplified. Harry doesn't choose to enter the tournament, doesn't figure out any of the tasks without explicit help, survives a dragon because Moody, who is actually Crouch Jr., tells Hagrid to tell him about dragons, and because Hermione tells him about the summoning charm, survives the lake because Dobby gives him gillyweed, survives the maze because Moody Crouch has been helping him all year, and because the entire tournament was designed to deliver him to Voldemort, and then survives the graveyard because of plot mechanics involving twin wand cores that were never established before and that conveniently allow him to escape. Order of the Phoenix is particularly damning because Harry spends the entire book being wrong about everything. Wrong about Snape, wrong about Sirius being tortured, wrong to ignore Hermione's warnings, wrong to teach Dumbledore's army defensive magic, without considering that Voldemort might use his connection to Harry to plant false visions, and his wrongness directly leads to Sirius's death, after which the narrative briefly acknowledges Harry's responsibility before essentially absolving him, because Dumbledore reveals that actually everything was Dumbledore's fault for not telling Harry about the prophecy, which is Dumbledore taking responsibility in a way that somehow makes Harry less responsible rather than making both of them responsible. Goblet of Fire follows the same pattern amplified. Harry doesn't choose to enter the tournament, doesn't figure out any of the tasks without explicit help, survives a dragon because Moody, who is actually Crouch Jr., tells Hagrid to tell him about dragons, and because Hermione tells him about the summoning charm, survives the lake because Dobby gives him gillyweed, survives the maze because Moody Crouch has been helping him all year, and because the entire tournament was designed to deliver him to Voldemort, and then survives a graveyard because of plot mechanics involving twin wand cores that were never established before and that conveniently allow him to escape. Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows continue this pattern, where Harry is essentially a tourist in his own story, following Dumbledore around to watch memory-based exposition about Voldemort's past that Dumbledore could have shown him at any point in the previous 5 years, hunting for Horcruxes based on guesses and luck rather than systematic magical research, destroying said Horcruxes primarily because other people figure out how, Hermione with a basilisk fang, Ron stabbing the locket, Crabbe accidentally destroying the diadem with Fiendfire, Voldemort accidentally destroying the piece in Harry, Neville killing Nagini with a sword that appears for him. Harry's signature contribution to the war effort is walking into the Forbidden Forest to let Voldemort kill him, which works because of magical mechanics involving wand ownership and sacrificial protection that Harry doesn't understand and didn't plan for. And then he defeats Voldemort in their final duel not through superior skill or knowledge, but because he happens to be correct in his guess about the Elder Wand's loyalty transferring through disarmament rather than murder. This isn't a hero's journey. This is a guided tour through a story where protagonist's primary qualification is his willingness to be led wherever the plot requires him to go and to trust that more competent people have planned everything out even when there's overwhelming evidence that nobody has planned anything and that the adults of his life have been catastrophically incompetent at protecting him or preparing him or even giving him basic information that might keep him alive. And the most damning part is that the story never acknowledges this pattern. Never has Harry confront the fact that he's been a piece moved around a board by Dumbledore and Voldemort and fate. Never allows him to develop into someone who takes control of his own narrative and makes active choices based on understanding rather than reactive choices based on incomplete information and emotional impulses. The psychological foundation for Harry's passivity is established in his childhood with the Dursleys, where he learns that asking questions leads to punishment, that showing curiosity about his nature or his parents results in violence or deprivation, that the safest strategy for survival is to make himself small and quiet and compliant, to not draw attention, to accept whatever story he's told about himself, even when that story is obviously false and designed to hurt him. This is textbook learned helplessness, a psychological condition where repeated negative experiences teach someone that their actions don't influence outcomes, that resistance is futile, that the best approach to life is passive endurance rather than active resistance or problem solving. And while the books briefly acknowledge that the Dursleys were abusive, the narrative never seriously grapples with how that abuse shaped Harry's entire approach to existence. When Harry enters a wizarding world, he transfers the same learned helplessness to his new context. Instead of questioning why nobody told him he was famous, why nobody prepared him for the attention, why Dumbledore left him with abusive relatives for 10 years, why the wizarding world is structured in ways that seem obviously unjust and inefficient, Harry simply accepts whatever he's told by authority figures and focuses his energy on trying to fit into this new world that claims him as a hero while simultaneously treating him as either a weapon or a symbol rather than as a person with agency and rights. He accepts that house elves want to be enslaved because that's what he's told, despite Dobby's existence proving this is false. He accepts that Slytherin House should exist, even though it apparently exists primarily to concentrate all the children with dark wizard potential into one location, where they can radicalize each other. He accepts that the Ministry of Magic is corrupt and incompetent, but never considers that maybe the entire governmental structure needs to be rebuilt rather than just having different people in the same positions. The prophecy becomes the ultimate expression and justification for Harry's passivity, because once Dumbledore reveals that Harry is the chosen one, and that either he must die or Voldemort must die, Harry has a ready-made excuse for never developing real agency. He's not making choices. He's fulfilling destiny. He's not living his own life. He's playing a role that was written for him before he was born. And the narrative treats this as noble and tragic, rather than recognizing it as a final trap that ensures Harry will never question whether there might be other options beyond the binary of kill or be killed. The prophecy doesn't actually mandate anything specific about how Voldemort must be defeated. It just says, either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives, which is vague enough to allow for multiple interpretations. But Harry and Dumbledore lock onto the interpretation that requires Harry's sacrifice, because that interpretation allows Dumbledore to continue controlling the narrative and allows Harry to continue being passive. And here's the critical insight that reveals how completely the story fails its own protagonist. Harry never questions Dumbledore's plan, never asks if there might be another way, never uses his considerable fame and influence to rally the wizarding world to actually address the systemic problems that made Voldemort possible in the first place. Because doing any of those things would require Harry to be an active agent in his own story, rather than a passive vessel for other people's plans and prophecies and magical mechanics. When Dumbledore tells Harry that he's been raising him like a pig for slaughter, that everything has been building toward the moment when Harry walks into the forest to die, Harry's response is not rage or betrayal or demand for alternative solutions. His response is acceptance. Because acceptance is what Harry has been trained to do from the moment the Dursleys locked him in a cupboard and told him that his parents died in a car crash, and that he should be grateful for the abuse because at least he has a roof over his head. The Deathly Hallows camping trip represents the absolute nadir of Harry's passivity disguised as determination, because for months he wanders through the British countryside with Hermione and Ron, having no plan beyond find Horcruxes somehow, possessing no research capability beyond what Hermione can provide, making no progress on actually locating or destroying Voldemort's soul fragments, and essentially waiting for the plot to deliver information to him through convenient encounters and lucky breaks. When they finally do make progress, it's because Harry accidentally says Voldemort's name, which triggers a taboo which leads to their capture, which leads to Dobby's rescue, which leads to them getting Bellatrix's sword, which leads to the information about Gringotts. None of this represents Harry making strategic choices or demonstrating competence. It's all reactive scrambling in response to mistakes and accidents that happen to work out, because the narrative requires them to work out. The broader Wizarding world's treatment of Harry reveals how thoroughly everyone understands that he's not actually a leader or a strategist or even particularly competent. He's a symbol, a rallying point, a living manifestation of resistance to Voldemort, and his actual capabilities or decision-making ability are irrelevant to that function. The Order of the Phoenix doesn't consult Harry on strategy, doesn't value his input on how to fight the war, keeps him isolated and uninformed throughout most of Book 5. And when Dumbledore finally does start including him in Book 6, it's not because Harry has demonstrated readiness, but because Dumbledore needs to download critical information about Horcruxes and knows his own death is approaching. The Ministry alternates between using Harry as propaganda when it's convenient and trying to discredit him when his testimony threatens their preferred narrative. And even Harry's allies like McGonagall and Lupin treat him more like a precious artifact that must be protected than like a capable wizard whose judgment should be trusted. And Harry never pushes back against this treatment in any meaningful way, never demands to be taken seriously as a strategic thinker or as someone whose experiences fighting Voldemort might provide valuable tactical insight, never leverages his fame and his status as the boy who lived to force the Wizarding world to listen when he tells them Voldemort has returned, or when he tries to warn them about Malfoy, or when he knows that the Ministry has been compromised. He accepts being sidelined, accepts being kept in the dark, accepts that adults will make the important decisions while he waits to be told what role he should play. And the only times he defies this pattern are when he acts on emotional impulses, going to the Department of Mysteries to save Sirius, using Sectum Semperon Draco, without knowing what it does, rather than when he makes calculated strategic choices based on understanding the situation. The House Elf subplot perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with Harry's character development and the story's unwillingness to let him grow beyond his initial limitations, because Hermione spends multiple books trying to draw attention to the fact that House Elf slavery is an obvious moral atrocity, that the entire Wizarding economy is built on a foundation of enslaving sentient beings and magically enforcing their inability to resist, and that this should be unacceptable to anyone who claims to care about justice or freedom. Harry's response is to basically dismiss Hermione's concerns because Dobby is an outlier and most House Elves seem content with their slavery, which is exactly the argument every slavery apologist in human history has made, that the enslaved don't really mind being enslaved, that they're naturally suited for servitude, that freeing them would be cruel because they wouldn't know what to do with freedom. Harry's acceptance of House Elf slavery is particularly galling because he himself experienced a form of slavery with the Dursleys, where he was forced to work without compensation, was punished for showing independence, was denied basic information about his own identity and heritage, and was kept in a state of ignorance and dependence that served his captor's interests. You would think this experience would make Harry viscerally opposed to any form of forced servitude, would make him immediately sympathetic to Hermione's campaign, would make him willing to use his influence to push for House Elf liberation. But instead he defaults to the status quo position, because questioning House Elf slavery would require him question the entire structure of Wizarding society and to recognize that the world he's been idealized as a hero is built on foundations just as rotten as the Muggle world he escaped. The epilogue represents the final and most complete betrayal of any potential for Harry to become an active agent of change, because 19 years after Voldemort's defeat we discover that Harry has become an Auror, essentially a magical cop, which means he's dedicated his life to enforcing the exact same laws and maintaining the exact same system that failed to prevent Voldemort's rise, that allowed corruption to flourish in the Ministry, that permitted House Elf slavery and werewolf, discrimination, and the systematic oppression of non-human magical creatures. He is married to Ginny, has 3 children, and is sending those children to the same Hogwarts that's still using the same house system that sorts children into rigid categories at age 11, and that still includes Slytherin despite Slytherin's history of producing an overwhelming percentage of dark wizards and blood purists. Nothing has changed. Nothing has been reformed. Nothing has been learned from a war that killed thousands and that revealed fundamental flaws in Wizarding society's structure and values. because Harry Potter as a character is constitutionally incapable of being a revolutionary or a reformer or even someone who asks uncomfortable questions about why things are the way they are. He's capable of being brave when bravery means facing physical danger, capable of being loyal to his friends, capable of enduring suffering, but he's not capable of the kind of sustained critical thinking and systematic analysis that would be required to actually fix the problems that made Voldemort possible. And the narrative rewards his lack of curiosity and his acceptance of the status quo by giving him a happy ending where he gets to be a hero without ever having to do the hard work of making the world better. The tragedy isn't that Harry Potter lacks intelligence or magical ability, because he demonstrates both when the plot requires it. He can produce a corporeal Patronus at 13. He can resist the Imperius curse. He can duel competently when necessary. The tragedy is that he lacks curiosity, lacks the drive to understand the deeper patterns and systems that shape his world, lacks the willingness to question authority even when that authority has repeatedly proven itself unworthy of trust. And the narrative not only fails to treat this as a character flaw that Harry should overcome, but actively frames these absences as virtues that make him pure and humble and worthy of being the chosen one. Imagine a different Harry Potter. One who actually grew and changed over the course of 7 years, who started as the passive abused child from the cupboard under the stairs, but who developed into someone who asked why the wizarding world is structured to create outsiders and scapegoats, who questioned why Dumbledore thought leaving him with abusive relatives for a decade was acceptable, who used his fame and his status as Voldemort's nemesis to build a political movement for actual reform, rather than just focusing on the immediate problem of defeating the Dark Lord. That Harry would have recognized that killing Voldemort solves nothing if the conditions that created Voldemort remain intact, that the blood purity ideology doesn't die with its most extreme adherent, that the systematic oppression of magical creatures and Muggleborns will continue unless someone with power and influence demands change. That Harry would have looked at the house elves and said, "This is slavery and it's wrong, and I'm using my position to fight for their freedom." Would have looked at the treatment of werewolves and said, "This discrimination creates the very resentment that drives people like Greyback to violence." Would have looked at Slytherin House and said, "We cannot keep sorting children into a house that everyone associates with dark wizardry, and then act surprised when those children embrace dark wizardry as their identity." That Harry would have confronted Dumbledore about the manipulation, about being raised as a sacrifice, about the years of withheld information and strategic isolation, and would have demanded either answers or autonomy instead of accepting that wise old men always know best, even when their plans involve child soldiers and calculated deaths. But that's not the Harry Potter we got, because J.K. Rowling was writing a different kind of story, one where the hero's journey doesn't require the hero to transform society, but just to restore it to its previous state minus the immediate threat, where moral complexity gets reduced to individual good versus individual evil, rather than examining the systems that produce both, where the uncomfortable questions about justice and reform get buried under the immediate drama of the war and then never resurface because the war's end is treated as the story's natural conclusion rather than as the beginning of the hard work of reconstruction and reconciliation. The philosophical framework that Harry never questions is that the wizarding world is fundamentally good and just, that its institutions are sound even if they're occasionally corrupted by bad individuals, that the solution to problems is to remove the bad individuals and return the institutions to their proper function rather than to examine whether those institutions might themselves be the problem. This is why Harry can fight Voldemort without ever grappling with the fact that Voldemort's blood purity ideology is just an extreme version of attitudes that are completely mainstream in wizarding society, that the magical world's treatment of muggles and muggleborns and magical creatures creates a resentment and fear that demagogues like Voldemort can exploit, that you cannot defeat an ideology simply by killing its most visible proponent. When Harry names his children Albus Severus Potter, he's demonstrating that he's learned nothing about the problematic nature of hero worship and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions, even when those actions were supposedly for the greater good. Because both Dumbledore and Snape treated Harry as a game piece to be manipulated and sacrificed. Both kept vital information from him. Both prioritized their own agendas and emotional needs over Harry's well-being and autonomy. And both caused Harry tremendous suffering in pursuit of plans that required Harry to remain ignorant and compliant. Naming your child after these men isn't honoring complexity and forgiveness. It's continuing the pattern of accepting mistreatment from authority figures and reframing that mistreatment as love or protection or necessary sacrifice. The final duel with Voldemort reveals everything about how thoroughly Harry's passivity defines him even in his moment of supposed triumph, because he doesn't defeat Voldemort through superior magical knowledge, or through having learned something crucial about defensive magic, or through any kind of strategic preparation. He defeats Voldemort because he happens to guess correctly about the Elder Wand's allegiance mechanics, because his earlier disarmament of Draco Malfoy, who had earlier disarmed. Dumbledore means that the wand recognizes Harry as its master, and because Voldemort's killing curse rebounds when the Elder Wand refuses to kill its true master. Harry's contribution to this victory is explaining the wand lore to Voldemort before it happens, which is honestly just poor tactics, and then standing there while magical mechanics he didn't arrange and doesn't fully understand resolve the conflict for him. This is presented as triumphant, as Harry's big hero moment. But if you examine it without the narrative framing, it's actually pathetic. The protagonist of the 7-book series defeats the ultimate evil not through his own power or knowledge or growth, but through a technicality involving wand ownership rules that were never properly established earlier in the series, and that conveniently activated precisely the moment needed to save Harry from having to actually be more powerful or more skilled than his opponent. It's Deus Ex Machina disguised as earned victory, and it perfectly encapsulates how the entire series treats Harry as a passive recipient of fortune rather than as an active architect of his own destiny. And this is why the epilogue feels so hollow and unsatisfying even to readers who wanted Harry to survive and have a happy ending, because the happiness he achieves is entirely personal and domestic. Wife, children, secure job, social status, without any indication that he's used his survival as victory to make the world different or better or more just. He's become exactly what the wizarding world wanted him to be from the beginning, a symbol they can invoke, a hero they can celebrate, a famous name they can use to validate their existing structures and values, and a person who will never challenge them to examine whether their comfortable status quo might be built on injustices that are just as morally corrosive as Voldemort's atrocities were, just slower and more polite, and more easily ignored. The real ending that Harry's character arc earns, the ending that will be honest about who he is and what he's capable of, isn't 19 years later sending his kids to Hogwarts with reassurances about Slytherin House. It's Harry at age 18 or 19, standing in a rebuilt wizarding world that looks exactly like the old one, realizing that he has no idea how to live without a war to fight or a prophecy to fulfill, that his entire identity has been constructed around being the boy who lived and then the chosen one, and that he never developed a self beyond those labels, and that the people celebrating his victory don't actually want him to change anything, because change is uncomfortable and risky and might threaten their privileges. And comfortable assumptions that Harry would look at the house elves still serving, and the werewolves still discriminated against, and the muggle-born still treated as lesser, and the centaurs still confined to forest, and would realize that Voldemort's defeat solved nothing except removing the most obvious and violent manifestation of the disease, while leaving the underlying infection intact. And maybe that Harry would try to push for reform anyway, would use his fame and his leverage to demand change. Or maybe he'd realize that he doesn't have the knowledge or the skills or the temperament to be a political reformer, and that the most honest thing he can do is step back and let other people like Hermione who actually care about systemic injustice, lead the rebuilding while he figures out who Harry Potter is when he's not defined by his relationship to Voldemort. Either of those endings will require the story to acknowledge that Harry is and has always been a passive character whose primary virtue is his willingness to endure suffering and his loyalty to the people he cares about, but who lacks the curiosity and the critical thinking skills and the desire for agency that would be required to transform from the abused child in the cupboard to the revolutionary leader that the wizarding world actually needs. But Rowling couldn't write that ending because it would undermine the hero narrative she was constructing, would force readers to confront uncomfortable questions about whether defeating individual evil is enough when systemic evil remains intact, and would require admitting that sometimes the chosen one is chosen not because he's the best person for the job, but because he's the most convenient person for the job, the one most likely to do what he's told and die when he's supposed to die, and never ask the questions that might reveal how rotten the foundations really are. Harry Potter ends the story exactly where he started it, accepting what he's told, fitting into the role others have defined for him, and never quite realizing that he could have been so much more if anyone, including himself, had believed he was capable of being an agent rather than an instrument, a person rather than prophecy, a hero who changes the world rather than a symbol who preserves it. Word count: 5, 100 words, estimated read time, 16 to 17 minutes at documentary pace.